What up, Raffle Nation? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new to this channel is called Raffle Nation. I am Raphael, and I bring you politics, economics, food and fun from Georgetown, Guyana. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now's a good time to do so. Click on the button, the little bell that will notify you, join the notification squad, so that you will be informed, you will be notified whenever I put out a new video. Remember to share this video with friends and family around the world, and click that little like button because it helps promote the video. YouTube algorithm promotes the video that gets more likes. Alright, so what I want to do today is to give you my assessment of the political candidates for the 2020 election cycle in Georgetown, Guyana. This is my assessment, my political awards for the Guyanese election cycle. And this is basically my assessment of the quality of the political representation in Guyana at this time. Now, you might have seen the video I put out before at the end of the last two videos, or the 2 or 3 videos before. I showed an encounter with Mr. Schuman, Mr. Lennox Schuman, at the Supreme Court. So Mr. Schuman showed up at the Supreme Court in his traditional Amerindian attire. So he had the headdress and very little else on, and he had of course his stick. Now Mr. Schuman is a Tushao, which is one of the chiefs or leaders in the Amerindian community, and so the way he dressed was meant to provoke as well as to bring attention to Amerindian issues. And so one of the things I wanted to do for this set of elections awards is to identify the candidates and the politicians in this election cycle who effectively brought attention to their constituents and who represented their constituents well. All right, I'm not going to go into the traditional partisan divides along race. What I'm going to do is look at the more substantial issues, the political candidates and the politicians that brought attention to substantial issues in the society. And they're the ones who are going to get the awards. Okay, so let's go. Okay, let's start by listing all of the politicians who had some significant role to play in this election cycle. And I'm going to start with Lennox Schuman, who represented the LJP, and he was the main voice of the LJP. There are some parties that had several, more than one representative, and so in that case I'm going to list more than one politician for some parties. Like the PPPC, for example, they had Mr. Jagdeo, who is the party's chairman and the main spokesperson for the party, but they also had a presidential candidate who was Mr. Irfan Ali. Then there was the APNU, that's APNU AFC, and they had a presidential candidate who was Mr. Granger and a prime ministerial candidate who was Mr. Mr. Moses Nagamutu in the current or in the previous election cycle, but they changed the representative to a new AFC candidate as their prime ministerial candidate in this election cycle, Mr. Kemrat Ramjatan. And then there was the ANUG, a New United Guyana, and they had 3 voices, or 3 faces representing the party. They had a presidential candidate who was the previous speaker from the PPP. So basically, Mr. Ram Karan, who was a previous Speaker of the House, Speaker of the National Assembly, left the PPPC to start his own party. And then there were a couple of younger politicians, new politicians like Mr. Timothy Jonas and Mr. Jonathan Yearwood. So those are the representatives for the ANUG. And then there was a TCI. So the last time I reported on this, I actually mixed the these two parties up. But the TCI is the Citizenship Initiative. And the Citizenship Initiative, their presidential candidate was Mrs. Rhonda Ann Lamb, right? So this is one of the three political parties that had a female presidential candidate, and so I'm going to separate a special category for the female presidential candidates. So TCI's presidential candidate, Miss Rhonda Ann Lamb. And then there was a TNM. So these are the two parties that mixed up, TCI and TNM. The TNM is a new movement, and their political candidate, their presidential candidate was Dr. Asha Kissoon. So she is a physician by practice, and she is the head of this new party. Their prime ministerial candidate, who is not as vocal as Dr. Asha Kissoon, was also a physician. And then there was the Fed Up Party. Now, they didn't have a presidential candidate, but they come in for mention because they were pretty loud in Region 6, the East Berbice, Quarantine area, and their politicians were Mr. Sohan and Mr. Ryan Crawford. And then there is Change Guyana. Their main speaker, their presidential candidate was Robert Badal, who was the principal investor at the Marriott, at the Pegasus hotels, and their Nigel Hines was one of the voices, the politicians, the vocal voices behind the Change Guyana political party, but it turns out that he was a dual citizen and therefore had to drop out of being the prime ministerial candidate. So the only voice I think worth assessing is that of Mr. Badal. And then there were two Christian political parties. The outstanding voice from the Christian political parties was Miss Phyllis Jordan. So Phyllis Jordan was a presidential candidate for one of those political parties. And then there was another female, I don't remember her name, I don't recall her name right now, but there was another female presidential candidate for one of the Christian political parties. So those are the sum total of the voices, the politicians who represented this election cycle. So let's talk about who represented themselves well and what that really means. What are the strengths and weaknesses coming out of this election cycle? Okay, so in order to keep this short, I'm going to limit this to 5 awards. I'm only going to give out 5 awards for this first set of political awards, my first set of political awards for this election cycle. And I'm going to focus mostly on the new political parties, although the PPC will come in for some mention. So the best newcomer, right? So the award for the best newcomer to the political scene, I would have to give that to Mr. Lennox Schumann from the LJP. Now, I attended Mr. Schumann's political, the launch of his political party back in February, I think it was, of 2019. February 2019, I attended the launch of the LJP. Oh, was it March? It was early in the year. February, March, or April. And what I picked up is that he had lifted the Canadian Constitution wholesale and created his manifesto from it. So he seemed to have lived in Canada. I think he's married to a Canadian citizen, and so he has his dual citizenship through marriage to a Canadian citizen. And from what I gathered at that launch is that he had a very liberal bias. So his political candidacy and his political views are biased on the left, the liberal side. which is fine because, you know, there are good things about it, like the equality and equity that he talks about for people with disabilities and minorities, LGBTQ community, and so on. Nobody else in this election cycle actually spoke about that. And so he seemed to have a very well thought out manifesto, but it came from basically lifting it entirely from the Canadian Constitution. But what was fascinating is that he managed to change his profile along the way. He started out as a candidate who wanted to speak to Guyana. He wanted to win the entire election. So he came across as a candidate who thought he was viable to win. It was viable for him to win the election. I knew, of course, from the beginning that with the kind of division that we have in society, he couldn't come as a newcomer to win. But later on, he started to tack to what was his strength, which is that he's an Amerindian chief, right, a Tushao, and that his strongest voice would be as a representative for the Amerindian community. And so he was able to do that in the end, after the elections, when he showed up at the Supreme Court. And you've seen that video where he argues for being allowed to enter court and to sit in session in his Amerindian official outfit, which is basically practically nothing, right? And he gains a lot of respect for his willingness to do that, to put himself out there. But it turns out this is something he's been doing for decades. He's been actually wearing this outfit in public and in various situations for very many years. And so what he did was nothing new for Mr. Schuman. It seemed like a stunt to gain attention, but it turns out that he does have a good cause, and the cause is that the representation of the Amerindian people in Guyana has long been lacking, and it's time for them to be taken and to take up a visible position in society. So I give Mr. Lennox Schuman the award for the best newcomer to the political scene. Number 2 is, who is the most handsome political candidate? Turns out this is an issue because after Timothy Jonas started appearing in various videos on social media, more and more comments tended to be directed at his appearance. They said he was the most handsome political candidate, and because he is tall and he is of mixed heritage. His background is both British and Guyanese. I think his parents are British and Guyanese, and that is how he got his dual citizenship. So Mr. Timothy Jonas, voted the most handsome political candidate. Unfortunately, his political views are not solid, not clearly thought out, and it turns out that a lot of what he advocates for is somehow contradictory. So for example, I'll give you an example. One of the issues that he was against is the issue of local content policy. So the business community in Guyana would like to see a policy implemented by the Guyana government enforcing some amount of local content in the oil and gas industry. In other words, a certain percentage of the contracts and the employees must be drawn from Guyanese. Now, Guyanese must get jobs in the oil and gas industry. Mr. Jonas is against that, right? And his reasoning is that if you do that, you're going to drive up the price. You're going to make business more expensive for ExxonMobil, and they're going to move away, or their business is going to be less profitable. He thinks that what we should do is we should tax these companies, ExxonMobil and Tullow and all of these. There are about 8 oil companies now drilling for oil in Guyana. So his view is that we should tax these companies, and we should take that money and give it to Guyanese who can't find jobs. Of course, that makes no sense, because what we want is a transfer of skills. We want Guyanese to be able to hold their own in the oil and gas industry over time, right? We want Guyanese to have not only representation, but eventually be able to take over some of these skilled jobs in the oil and gas industry. So this is kind of a muddled message coming from Mr. Jonas, but he does get the award for the most handsome political candidate. Who was the most controversial political candidate in this election cycle? That would have to go to Mr. Irfaan Ali. Mr. Irfaan Ali has the most scandal, brought the most scandal to the um, political arena and controversy even within his party. I think it is fairly well acknowledged that he was not the party's choice. He was Mr. Jagdeo's choice for the presidential candidate. So Mr. Jagdeo, who is the most vocal voice in the PPC at this time, People's Progressive Party Civic, chose Mr. Irfaan Ali. And then we know of the scandal that emerged where Mr. Irfaan Ali was found to not have completed his bachelor's degree before he was awarded a master's degree, and now he claims to have a PhD from a reputable university. So it turns out that there is evidence of academic fraud, and this issue was never really properly addressed during the entire election cycle, and so it left a cloud of controversy over his head. So the most controversial political candidate in this election cycle was Mr. Irfaan Ali. For the best female, right? So the best female political candidate, number 4, I would say that goes to Miss Asha Kissoon. Sasha Kissoon was the presidential candidate for the New Movement. The New Movement is his new political party, and they actually had a fairly decent message, that is that they wanted more young people involved in politics. It wasn't clear exactly what specific policies they wanted, but they said that we want to see more professionals, Guyanese professionals in politics, and I would say she got a very good message across in that way. The other female political candidate who comes in for very good mention is Miss Rhonda Ann Lamb. She is the presidential candidate for the TCI, the Citizenship Initiative. So it's debatable whether she should in fact get the best female political candidate in this election cycle, because she was also quite vocal, but her voice tended to be more visible in the post-election events. So she was in fact seen calling for recounts. And I suppose if I were to give if I were to give this award to the two of them, it would probably be fair. Both Miss Asha Kissoon, because I saw her in the debates leading up to the elections, where she appeared on stage with about 5 of the smaller political parties, and she was able to represent the New Movement, where I didn't see Miss Rhonda Ann Lamb in that debate, but she did in fact make her presence felt, Miss Lamb, on social media, right? So she tended to have more social media presence. And finally, number 5, for the political candidate who spent the most money, who made the greatest impact in sort of ads in the media, I would give that to Mr. Robert Badal. So Mr. Badal spent a lot of money canvassing on social media and in the television and radio media in Guyana, putting out his message, which tended to be business oriented. So he was the one who captured my attention because he supported lower taxes. So he was arguing for reduced taxes for imported vehicles in Guyana. And, I did a video previously explaining that Guyana, we have extremely high taxes, over 300% taxes on imported vehicles, and these are even used vehicles. So he was the only political candidate who mentioned this as a major issue in this this election cycle, and so he gets the award for the one political candidate who used advertisement to have the greatest impact. And I think that is significant because I think he might have been, I think when the elections results are recounted, you will find that he is either the number 2 or number 3 vote getter. In other words, just by sheer advertisements in the media, he was able to get the third or fourth highest votes. I think he's about the third based on the numbers that I'm looking at in this review, statistical review of the election results. So those are the 5 awards I'm giving out at this time. There are going to be more awards, but next I want to talk about the statistical analysis of this election cycle, and I want to give you my selection, in other words, who I voted for, explaining based on statistics, because I did the statistics and did this analysis before and after the election, decided that this is who I'm going to vote for and this is why. So that is what's coming up in the next episode of this series. If you want to see more content like this, click like and subscribe. Remember, share this video with friends and family around the world. Let people know what's happening in Guyana. Later!